Welcome to my channel and to tonight's Death Row Dinners video, where I will be eating the last meal of somebody who has been on death row and then telling you how they ended up there. For his final meal, John Martin Scripps had pizza and hot chocolate. Now, I don't have hot chocolate because I couldn't get any from the place that I got my pizza, and I thought I would order from a local place that I don't think I've featured on my channel before, because yes, I could have got one from a supermarket, but I just thought this would be more interesting for you guys. So the company is called Canotto Pizza. This is a 14-inch pizza, and I've gone for, they call it the Big Granny, I believe, and I asked for mushrooms on it because I love mushrooms. It didn't say exactly what topping Scripps had on his pizza. I'm assuming it probably involved lots of meat, which I just don't like. So I am pretty hungry and looking forward to trying this, although it is huge. But then, what did I expect? It's 14 inches. So good. Piping hot, really cheesy, lovely thin base, but it is crispy as well. I didn't bother to order a dip. To be honest, I forgot. I could make a hot chocolate, but I'm not going to. I mean, it's the food part that matters. I will eat as much of this as I can, and the rest will probably go in the fridge to be reheated. As ever, I'm going to hand over to a different version of me to tell you more about the crimes of John Martin Scripps. This version is going to watch Below Deck Sailing Yacht and have pizza. Whilst all of the cases I have covered so far in this series have been American, it's not the only country to have had the death penalty. For tonight's case, we'll be going to Singapore, but the story begins a little closer to home, in England. John Martin Scripps was born in Hertfordshire in England on December 9th, 1959. He was the second child of Leonard and Jean Scripps, who already had a daughter called Janet. When he was still very young, his parents made the move to London. Throughout his childhood, Scripps was close to his father, who worked as a lorry driver. His mother was a Fleet Street barmaid. He would often travel on the road with Leonard. Tragedy struck when, at the age of just 10, Scripps lost his father to suicide. Jean had decided to leave him for another man, and Leonard used a gas oven to end his life. It was John who found his father's body. In 1973, Scripps was at a cadet training camp in France when he absconded. At age 15, he left school because of undiagnosed dyslexia. He began travelling about, making money from odd jobs and selling antiques. In 1974, he was convicted in juvenile court for theft and burglary. He was given a 12-month conditional discharge and fined £10, which in today's money is about £134. This did not deter him, and in 1976 he was fined a further £40, which is £534, for a further 3 thefts. Scripps was described as a mild-mannered and reserved man, and one who seems to have had no real friends. His first adult conviction was in 1978 for indecent assault. In his early 20s, he married a Mexican lady called Maria Arellanos, and she is believed to be the only person outside of his family that he ever truly loved. Originally from Cancun, Maria and John met when they were both travelling in Montreal. She was 17 and he was 21. After travelling abroad together for a couple of years, the pair returned to settle in England. Scripps returned to old habits. Maria had believed him to be working in imports and exports and was shocked to discover the truth. From 1978 to 1982, he had several further convictions for burglaries in London and in Israel. In 1982, he was again jailed, this time in Surrey, for burglary and assault. He took the first chance he got to flee when he was allowed to return home on a few days' leave and absconded to America and Southeast Asia. He was just a few months away from completing his sentence, and Maria had had enough. She divorced him whilst he was incarcerated and remarried to a police constable who was part of the Royal Protection Squad, a man named Ken Cold. This angered Scripps, and, in an act of revenge, he stole some of Ken's clothing from their home. Maria agreed to divorce Ken and return home to Cancun. John Martin Scripps legally changed his name to John Martin. In 1985, he was back in Surrey, jailed once more for burglary. Again, he absconded, this time smuggling drugs as he travelled throughout various countries. In 1987, he was apprehended in London and jailed for drug-related offences. In June 1990, he absconded again, but by November, he was back in jail, this time in Winchester for possession of heroin. In 1993, whilst in prison on the Isle of Wight, his good behaviour earned him the benefits of a model prisoner. He was allowed to work as a dishwasher in the kitchens. Then he was promoted to the position of butcher. He was taught the necessary skills by a prison officer and another prisoner who had previously worked as a butcher. By October 1994, he was at the Mount prison in Hertfordshire. His mother asked the Home Office not to grant him day release. She became aware that Scripps had sold off most of his possessions to other inmates and sensed that he was preparing to run once again. Sure enough, on October the 31st, he fled, travelling through Holland, Belgium, Paris and Spain. Jean Scripps later said, "The Home Office have buried their head in the sand over this. They know full well that if they had done what I told them, none of this would have ever happened. I begged them not to let him go." Scripps used the birth certificate of a cellmate, Simon Davis, in order to obtain a passport that would get him out of the country. He flew to Mexico, presented himself at the British Embassy there as John Martin, and explained that he had lost his passport. They were able to furnish him with a replacement. It was on the 8th of March 1995 that Scripps landed in Singapore on a flight from San Francisco. Whilst at Changi Airport, he met fellow tourist Gerard George Lowe, who came from South Africa. He was 32, worked as a brewery engineer, and had come on a shopping trip. The two men agreed to share a room at the Riverview Hotel. Scripps checked into room 1511 under the false name of Simon James Davis. The following day, Scripps asked the hotel to remove Gerard's name from their registry. Over the next 2 days, Scripps made liberal use of Gerard's credit card, racking up $8,775 in cash, purchasing a VCR for $499, which he sent back to his sister Janet in England, and a pair of expensive Nike Alpha running shoes. He also attended a performance by the Singapore Symphony Orchestra on the 10th. It was on the 11th at approximately 6:35 a.m. that security guards at the hotel saw Scripps leave with a heavy suitcase. They noted that he returned about 15 minutes later, but without the suitcase. Shortly after this, he checked out of the hotel and made his way to Bangkok. Between the 13th and 16th of March, black bin bags containing parts of a dismembered body were found floating in Singapore's harbour. A torso and lower limbs were recovered from the waters around Clifford Pier. Gerard's wife, Vanessa, was able to make an identification, though his head and arms were never recovered. She had phoned to report him missing after not hearing from him for a few days, and he was a man who checked in daily with his family when he was abroad. Gerard's work colleagues were also putting out feelers, trying to find out any information on his whereabouts. Meanwhile, Scripps boarded a plane in Bangkok bound for Phuket. On the same flight were a couple of Canadian tourists, 49-year-old Sheila Damude and her 22-year-old son Darrin. Sheila worked as an administrator at the Pacific Christian School in Victoria, and Darrin was a student there. They ended up sitting in the same row on board the flight as Scripps and struck up conversation. When the flight landed, they all checked into Nili's Marina Inn, which faced Patton Beach. Scripps was in room 48 and the Damudes in room 43. The mother and son were last seen at breakfast on the 16th of March at 11 a.m. Later that day, Scripps asked to transfer from room 48 to room 43 as the Damudes had checked out and he would be covering their bill. Their bodies were later found, both having been dismembered. On March 19th, Scripps flew back to Singapore and he was arrested upon arrival at Changi Airport. He was found in possession of passports belonging to Gerard, Sheila and Darrin, as well as their credit cards and some of their belongings. He was also carrying knives, a 1.3 kilogram hammer, a stun gun, handcuffs, and a can of mace, exactly what I like to take in my hand luggage. He had over $40,000 in cash and traveller's checks. He told authorities his name was Simon Davis, and he was charged with forgery on March 21st. By March 25th, Scripps' true identity had been discovered, and he was then charged with the murder of Gerard Lowe. During this time, body parts belonging to the Damudes were found in a deserted mine in Phuket. They were known to have been on the same flight as Scripps into Phuket and to have been staying in the same hotel. 5 days later, a torso and 2 pairs of arms and legs were found alongside a road. The state of decomposition was so bad that identification had to be made through dental records. Some pieces of Darrin's body have never been recovered. On the 2nd of April, another black bin bag with further body parts was recovered from the Singapore harbour. On the 4th, Scripps tried to convince police that an unnamed British friend of his had been responsible for the disposal of the body. Swabs from the hammer he had been transporting were tested and found to match blood found in the Damude's hotel room. Over 77 witness statements were gathered by the prosecution, supporting not only the murder charge, but offences such as forgery, vandalism, cheating, possession of drugs and weapons. They also wanted to try to link him to the 2 murders in Thailand, but Thai authorities were waiting for forensic evidence before filing any charges. It was on September 18th that Scripps was formally charged of Gerard's murder in a Singapore court. His trial began on October 2nd and was considered to be sensational. British tabloids nicknamed Scripps the tourist from hell. Throughout the judicial process, Scripps was in leg irons, sitting in a cage made from glass and metal between 2 heavily armed guards. Singapore did not have jury trials, and Scripps entered no plea but was claiming trial. This meant that he was opposing the charges. The court heard how Gerard Lowe's body had been expertly cut up and wrapped in plastic. A pathologist gave his opinion that this was done by someone with surgical, veterinary or butchery training. Testimony from James Quigley, a prison officer at Albany Prison on the Isle of Wight, was heard, in which he recalled teaching Scripps how to butcher animals. He was instructed in butchery over a 6-week period in March and April 1993. He was trained to bone out forequarters and hindquarters of beef, sides of bacon, carcasses of pork, and how to portion chicken. Quigley described Scripps as a quick learner. Police officers testified about the arrest of Scripps at the airport and that he had replaced the photos in all 4 passports he was carrying with his own. Quite how he was going to pass for a 49-year-old woman, I'm not sure. By this point, a warrant had been issued for Scripps in relation to the murders in Phuket. A confession from Scripps was admitted as evidence. In it, he confirmed that he met Gerard Lowe at Changi Airport and that the two men agreed to share a hotel room. He also admitted to killing Lowe, but claimed he did it out of fear. According to Scripps, he awoke to find Gerard, half naked and smiling, touching his buttocks. Scripps asserted that he was not homosexual, and he had had previous experience of unwanted encounters with men who were. Whilst in prison in 1978 and later in 1994, he claimed to have endured sexual assaults, but had made no report of these at the time. This caused him to freak out, kicking, swearing, and using a hammer to hit Gerard several times on the head until he collapsed. Again, I have to question why he was travelling with a hammer if he wasn't planning anything. But there we go. It was at this point Scripps noticed that his hand was covered in blood and realised that Gerard was dead. He claimed it had all happened so quickly, and he had reached out to a British friend for help. He refused to name this friend, whom he claimed had dismembered and disposed of the body. The defence did their best to convince the court that Scripps had not intended to kill Gerard, and it should therefore be a charge of manslaughter, which carried a maximum sentence of life in prison. The prosecution contested this, stating that the murder was premeditated and committed with the intention of robbing Gerard. They presented a notebook which had been found in Scripps' luggage. It contained tracing paper and versions of attempts at Gerard's signature, indicating that Scripps had been practising it. There was also the fact that no trace of blood had been recovered from the bedroom in the hotel, where Scripps alleged the incident had occurred. It was found only in the bathroom. The defence tried to argue that inadequate testing had been carried out and requested an adjournment to review evidence the prosecution wished to enter, connecting Scripps to the murders in Thailand. The prosecution used the evidence that Scripps had used Gerard's credit card to go on a shopping spree after the killing and to attend a musical concert to demonstrate that he was neither dazed nor confused at the time of the killing. Scripps claimed to have no memory of attending the concert, the ticket and programme for which were later found in his belongings. He said that, as far as he recalled, he had gone out drinking with a British friend that evening. The prosecution pressed him on his movements between the 8th and 11th of March. Scripps used the fact that he was dyslexic and therefore got things mixed up to explain why he could not give firm accounts of his activities on these dates. He is suspected of choosing Caucasian victims because they were further away from home and therefore more vulnerable and less likely to be reported missing. Scripps told the court that he had considered slitting his wrists because he believed he would be hanged. It was confirmed that, shortly after his arrest, he had attempted to injure himself with a small piece of glass whilst in custody. Scripps also stated that whilst a skilled butcher could dismember an animal within about 5 minutes, it wouldn't be the same with a human. Whilst the bones looked similar, Scripps did not have the skills required to do this. He also claimed not to have alerted authorities about Lowe's death because he believed that it would mean an automatic death sentence in Singapore. He alleged that he'd called upon the aid of a British friend whom he'd known for about 8 to 10 years and recalled that his friend had spent time working in an abattoir. Scripps stayed in the hotel of this friend whilst Gerard's body was butchered and disposed of. When the prosecutor, Jennifer Marie, asked him to name this friend, he refused, as he was afraid of the repercussions it could have on his family, as this friend was a very dangerous man. He was unable to give any description of the friend's hotel on Sentosa, a resort island linked to Singapore via a small causeway. Despite the judge cautioning him that this refusal to give the requested information could harm his defence, Scripps remained resolute. This made it easy for the prosecution to argue that this story was a complete fabrication, particularly when his previous statements to the police made no mention of any homosexual activities or attempted assaults on Scripps by Gerard Lowe. Indeed, Gerard's widow testified that he was definitely not homosexual. The prosecution closed by arguing that the conduct of the accused after the killings suggested that he was cold, callous and calculating, a far cry from the confused, dazed man walking in a dream world, the picture he gave of himself. He is a man who has no qualms about lying continuously, consistently, and even on the witness stand, in any and every matter. Scripps was presented as a cold, calculating killer who lied and preyed upon tourists. The defence urged the court to find Scripps guilty of culpable homicide, but not of murder. They said he was not a man prone to violence, and the killing occurred in a heated moment as a result of provocation. They also suggested that any notion that Scripps had been involved in the 2 murders in Thailand should be discounted, as there was nothing more than circumstantial and prejudicial evidence linking him to the 2 Canadians. The judge, T.S. Sinathury, retired on 7th November to consider his verdict. On the 10th of November, he was ready to deliver his findings. Whilst waiting for the judge to enter the courtroom, Scripps was reportedly laughing and joking within his glass cage, and is alleged to have said, "Karma is karma. It's in God's hands now." In his verdict, the judge said, "I'm satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that Martin had intentionally killed Lowe. After that, he disarticulated Lowe's body into separate parts, and it was he who subsequently disposed of the body parts by throwing them into the river behind the hotel. On the evidence, I had no difficulty to find that it was Martin who was concerned with the deaths of Sheila and Darrin, and for the disposal of their body parts found in different sites in Phuket. The disarticulation of the body parts of Lowe, Sheila and Darrin have the hallmark signs of having been done by the same person. Altogether, this similar fact evidence reinforces the decision I have made, for it puts beyond doubt that Martin is guilty on the charge of murder. The sentence of this court upon you is that you will be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and taken to a place to be hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may the Lord have mercy on your soul." Scripps was found guilty of the murder and dismemberment of Gerard Lowe and convicted. He was given the death sentence, and his defence lawyers, Edward Pereira and Joseph Teixeira, made it clear that this would be appealed. Scripps showed no outward emotion as this sentence was delivered. On January the 4th, 1996, Scripps withdrew his appeal. He also declined to seek a pardon from President Cheong on the 10th of March. In the days leading up to his hanging, Scripps wrote a misspelled note saying, "One day poor, one day reach. Money fills the pain of hunger, but what will fill the emptiness inside? I know that love is beyond me. So do I give myself to God, the God that has betrayed me. Can I be a person again? Only time will tell me. You may take my life for what it is worth, but grant those that I love peace and happiness." He spoke of an emptiness within him. Just 4 days before his execution, Scripps had an interview with criminologist Christopher Berry D. Scripps described to him in detail how he murdered Gerard Lowe, dismembering and disposing of his body. Upon hearing the news that Scripps had been hanged, his ex-wife Maria said, "John disappeared on several trips and went to the United States and Southeast Asia. I knew something awful was happening, but I could not believe he had started killing people. I knew this would happen to John, but I didn't know that it would hurt so much. The last memory I have of him is a message he sent me, promising me we would meet in the next life and that he would never let me go again." On the 19th of April, 1996, John Martin Scripps was executed by hanging at Changi Prison. He was the first Westerner to be hanged in Singapore for murder. Whilst he was only convicted of Gerard's murder, he was linked to those of Sheila and Darrin. It's also believed that he may have been responsible for other murders in San Francisco, Mexico and Belize. Scotland Yard connected him to the murder of 2 Londoners, financial advisor Timothy McDowell and accountant William Shackle. Scripps reportedly told his then-wife Maria that he had been scuba diving with Timothy, who was taking scuba diving lessons in Belize. He disappeared in early 1995, and whilst body parts were recovered, police could not conclusively confirm that they belonged to Timothy. What they could confirm was that £21,000 was transferred from Timothy's bank account to one held by Scripps. Some of his documents had also been found in Scripps' possessions. Police wanted to question Scripps whilst he was in custody in Singapore, but Scripps declined to speak with them. It is believed that Timothy was killed as he slept and his body thrown into a river infested with crocodiles. William Shackle was a 24-year-old backpacker who was known to be spending some time in Cancun. He was reported missing shortly after cashing in £4,000 worth of travellers' cheques. Scripps was said to be in Cancun at the time of William's disappearance. All 3 confirmed victims of Scripps, as well as the 2 suspected victims, were simply tourists. People going on holiday, looking to explore the world and have a break from the mundane realities of day-to-day life. Scripps targeted them purely out of greed, and the callous treatment of their bodies after death showed no remorse or even acknowledgement that these were other human beings with lives and families, hopes and dreams. As ever, the names I want you to remember are the names of the people whose lives were lost and are attributed to Scripps. Gerard Lowe, Sheila Damude, Darrin Damude, Timothy McDowell, William Shackle.